Thank you for joining us. We are honored and privileged to have with us in the studio Dr. John Edwin Mason of the University of Virginia. Dr. Mason is an historian and is on the faculty in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. John was an Army brat and grew up, as he says, all over the world, but he did graduate from high school in Cincinnati, Ohio. He obtained his bachelor's degree from the University of Cincinnati, went on to do graduate work, obtaining 2 masters at Yale University, and then earning his PhD from Yale in 1992. John Edwin Mason teaches African history and the history of photography. He has written extensively on early 19th century South Africa history, especially the history of slavery, South African popular culture, especially the Cape Town New Year's Carnival and jazz, and the history of photography. He is now working on Gordon Parks and American Democracy, a book about the ways in which Parks Life magazine photo essays on social justice and the books that he published during the civil rights era challenged Americans' notions of citizenship, and at the same time made him one of the era's most significant interpreters of the Black experience. Dr. Mason, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here, Ted. Thanks very much.
It's a real honor.
And please call me John, Ted.
All righty, I will. Thank you. Again, it's a real honor, John, to have you with us, and I look forward to a conversation about somebody we both hold in high esteem,
Absolutely.
Gordon Parks. So let's just get started.
Sure.
Why are you writing about Gordon Parks?
He's the most fascinating person I've encountered in my professional career. I spent the first part of my career writing history about ordinary people. I wrote about slaves, I wrote about slave owners, I wrote about people who weren't famous, but people who did appear in the archives. And now for the first time, I find myself writing about somebody who was really extraordinary. Somebody who was one in not a million, not 10 million, probably 1 in 100 million. A man who had an amazingly complex and extraordinary life, who started out poor, became even more poor and almost homeless for a time, had brush with petty crime, but then ascends to the top of his profession as a photojournalist and as a documentary photographer, becomes a very good writer, becomes an esteemed filmmaker, and along the way composes music. And a man who also had the most remarkable private life, a man who was almost always surrounded by people who genuinely loved him and held him in great affection. So it's an interesting experience to be shifting gears into writing about somebody who was, well, I've used the word, but truly extraordinary.
Well, he truly was, and I can so identify with what you said about the many friendships and the people that surrounded Gordon throughout his life, and both men and women. I like to tell the story that Gordon loved women and women loved Gordon, and you look at just those special friendships that he had over the years. It's amazing.
Well, my particular interest is photography. But his personality informs his photography, and I think in a variety of different ways. Now, the photography, as you know, that I'm most interested in are the photo essays that he published in Life magazine during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s on issues that related to race and social justice, and poverty as well. And they're very, very powerful. His interest in those subjects is clearly related to the fact that he was a black man in America, but that he had experienced the kind of poverty, but also the kind of racism that his subjects had.
Absolutely.
But there's another part of Gordon Parks, as we know, that he did all kinds of photography for Life magazine, including fashion photography and celebrity photography and lifestyle photography. He photographed famous actresses like Ingrid Bergman. He photographed Ernest Hemingway's Paris. He photographed the great fashion models, the supermodels of the day, wearing Dior and the other great designers. And so there's a part of him, the things that allowed him to do that were also the things that allowed him to work his way into people's lives. When he was doing these photo essays, whether they're on a famous actress or whether they're on an impoverished family in Rio or Harlem, he becomes a friend. He becomes a member of the family. He becomes an uncle to the children. And there's example after example of this where people will talk about what Gordon Parks meant to them. And, you know, there's something about the man that's very elusive, but is very real, that allowed him to establish comfortable, friendly relationships with the likes of Ingrid Bergman, the great actress on the one hand, and then Flavio, the desperately poor, uneducated Brazilian boy in the favela in Rio. So remarkable.
Well, it is, and of course, I'm taken to Gordon's iconic photograph of Ella Watson that he did with the Farm Security Administration.
That's right.
And then you turn to Red Jackson in Harlem for Life, and he was able to identify with all sorts of people. And I think that's a good segue, John, that I wanted to ask you. As we know, Gordon spent his first 15 years in Kansas, in Fort Scott. Do you have a sense of how those early years formed Gordon Park to become the man he was?
Sure. I think he was deeply ambivalent about Kansas and about Fort Scott. On the one hand, he grew up in a very warm and loving and supportive family. There's no question about that. And he talked about his family, and especially his mother, but also his father, as providing the foundation that he built everything in his life. The foundation of values, right? The foundation of dignity and respect and hard work. Those never left him. It was also a big and loving family, and he had the support of his siblings for much of his life as well. So those are the good things. And he had friendships. As you know, he came back to Fort Scott on assignment from Life magazine in 1950 to find out what had happened to the people that he had graduated ninth grade from the segregated Plaza School in Fort Scott. And he approached that assignment with real affection for his classmates. You know, these were deep friendships and deep relationships. So family and friendship, those were so important to him. That was a good part about Fort Scott. But Fort Scott was a very southern town. It was in a northern state. But in terms of race relations in Fort Scott, it was a segregated town. The movie theaters were segregated, the drugstore lunch counters were segregated, the cemetery was segregated. And segregation did not mean separate but equal. It was separate but unequal, right? So the schools that the African American kids went to, well, they weren't as good as the schools that the white kids did. The teachers tried to do their best. The principal, who was principal of the Plaza School, E.J. Hawkins, when Gordon Parks was there, I mean, he was a revered figure in the community.
He was.
So they did the best they could, but the best they could was not equal to whites. You look at the cemetery. The cemetery is very, very telling. It used to be segregated. The white part of the cemetery is up high on a slope, and the black part of the cemetery is down low in a very sort of wet area, you know. There was a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy in the movie theater. The blacks sat in the balcony. So, you know, he experienced not just those forms of segregation, but really harsh racism, you know, that, you know, being called the worst sort of words you can call somebody, you know, being beat up because of the color of his skin, and that scarred him. So he had this ambivalence about Fort Scott, this push and pull of
love-hate relationship.
You know, love-hate relationship, there's no question, and it lasted until the end of his life. Now, he did reconcile with Fort Scott.
Right.
He's buried in Fort Scott. Fort Scott desegregated the cemetery. There's a nice monument to him in the cemetery that has 2 poems on it. Both poems are about Fort Scott and about him coming to a reconciliation, but it is an uneasy reconciliation. He does not dismiss the bad things that happened, but he says that, you know, the good things, they probably outweigh the bad.
Well, and much of what you're talking about, John, leads to story after story that we could tell and discuss about Gordon. Obviously, with limited time, we want to focus, but that whole story about Evergreen Cemetery and how he came to grips with. That was his final resting place, and the role of the mayor of the Fort Scott at the time, Ken Lunt, is just a fabulous story. And the other thing, when you talk about his school experience, as you know, Gordon loved to tell the story how he had a guidance counselor, or one of his teachers, actually discouraged him from going to college.
That's right.
And said it will be a waste of time. The best you can do is to be a college or a trained porter or a waiter, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that really affected Gordon, I think. And of course, he took great pride in later life of bragging about his 50 honorary doctorates from institutions all over the country.
Yeah, yeah. There's a quote in one of his autobiographies where it's something like, "I was born with a burning need to be somebody." He did have this inner fire. You know, I was talking about him being such a remarkable and extraordinary man, and what allowed him to do that was great talent. There's no question about that, and great intelligence. There's no question about that either. But intelligence and talent will only get you so far. You have to work, and he had this burning fire that compelled him to work. I don't think he was somebody who ever had to force himself to get out of bed and get to work.
I agree.
You know, it was like the air that he breathed. It was just as necessary to him as the love of a beautiful woman was to him, that he had to work. And I think you're right, that burning impulse to create, part of that was to prove to Fort Scott was wrong about him. And about the other black kids, by the way, they all got the same advice. You take the general education courses, don't take the college prep courses. The only jobs available to you will be somebody's cook or somebody's housekeeper or somebody's porter. Right. And of course, you know that once he went back to Fort Scott in 1950, this is some 27 years, I think, after his 9th grade class graduated, what he discovered was that virtually all of his classmates had sought their fortune elsewhere, you know, because Fort Scott had very little to offer African Americans. So they were in Kansas City and Chicago and Detroit and Columbus, Ohio and San Diego, and somebody was in Arizona.
Exactly, exactly. And that's where you went, where you felt there was opportunity.
Right.
Let's go back and just briefly, because in my view, the essence of Gordon Parks emanated from his mother, Sarah.
Yeah.
What are your impressions of Sarah Parks, John?
She's elusive. You know, we know very little about her except what Gordon wrote. And Gordon did talk about her as his rock and his foundation, and somebody who instilled in him the values that allowed him to accomplish everything that he did in his life. He wrote his first autobiography and called it A Choice of Weapons. And he means actually two things when he says a choice of weapons. The one that we commonly think of, we think that he chose the weapons of the camera and the typewriter as weapons against injustice. And that's actually true, absolutely. And he talked about that consistently through his life. But in that book, he also talks about a choice of weapons, the weapons his mother gave him. And those are the weapons of dignity and respect and compassion and love. Love was always big. Dignity and compassion and love. So he always believed that his mother was so important to him. We know very little about her aside from that, though. There was, but it's interesting that there was an obituary published in the Fort Scott paper when she passed away. And that was very unusual for an African American to get an obituary in the paper. Well, she got one. And the paper talks about her as somebody who is very respected and even beloved in town. So she had obviously established a reputation for herself. She worked as a housekeeper, but she was also very prominent in the local African Methodist Episcopal Church, the black church in town. So she was somebody that even the white community respected. And so that's unusual, and that tells us that she was indeed an extraordinary woman.
I think it does tell us a lot, and do I recall that would have been 1928?
Right in there, that's right.
And at that, and we think in terms of the time, it was pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
It reflects on her so well.
I think so.
Let's move on, and Gordon's career, Gordon's life, what he accomplished, how he accomplished it, what does that mean to African Americans?
That's an interesting question. Parks was a famous man in the 1960s. 1968, CBS News did a documentary about him. In 1963, his novel, The Learning Tree, had been a bestseller. It had been reviewed everywhere. It was assigned in schools to read. His first autobiography, A Choice of Weapons, was published a few years later. It also was a hit and got tremendous attention. So people really knew who he was in the 60s. And then in the 70s, he becomes a legitimate celebrity. He starts making movies, right? He turns The Learning Tree, his novel about growing up in Fort Scott. He turns The Learning Tree into a movie. It was the first Hollywood studio production to be directed by an African American. He goes on to make Shaft, which is a detective story, a black private detective in Harlem taking on the mafia. But it's a really good movie. It holds up as entertainment.
Well, and John Shaft is an amazing character.
Yeah, that's right. He makes a series of movies after that. So there's a time when Gordon Parks is first famous and then a genuine celebrity, and everybody knew who he was and knew his work. And I think he meant a lot then. It's funny how fleeting fame is. We're here at Wichita State. And I'm here because this wonderful exhibition has opened at the Ulrich of Gordon Parks Photography. I was lucky enough to be a consultant on that and to do some of the writing for it that went into the brochure. But while I'm here at Wichita State, among other things, I met with a group of Wichita State students. These are very bright kids. These were from the honors program. And we had a great time in the gallery talking about Gordon Parks and talking about the photographs, and I was showing them around. But I always like to begin a conversation, especially with students, by asking them, well, who knows who Gordon Parks is? And so I asked, and these are bright kids. They've had good schooling. Only a couple of them had even heard the name Gordon Parks before they walked into the gallery. And then I asked them even, how many of you have seen Shaft, the movie? And very few have seen that. So, you're asking, what does Gordon Parks mean to African Americans now? And I think it's partly a generational question, and I think it is also partly how involved you are in the arts. So an African American who is elderly or middle-aged and who's involved in the arts will certainly know Gordon Parks and think of Gordon Parks as one of the great black artists of the 20th century. No question about that. And I have to say, black photographers, they worship Gordon Parks. But ordinary African Americans, I don't think he's fallen out of consciousness, especially for the younger generation. I think that's true for white Americans as well. I think that he's less well known than he ought to be. And one of the reasons that I'm writing the book that I'm writing is to bring him back into popular memory and into popular culture, and to make the argument for his absolute vital importance in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as a photographer.
Well, and I totally agree, obviously, that his life is one that needs to be applauded, recognized, discussed, viewed, and studied because of everything he accomplished and the way he accomplished it in the time that he did that.
That's right.
And so I'm really looking forward to your lecture at the Ulrich Museum talking about Gordon and social justice. Let me then take you to Life magazine. And I think Gordon started there initially in 1948. He spent a couple of decades working at Life magazine. And in the context of the time, Life magazine was the CNN of the day, if you will.
Absolutely.
That magazine weekly was on every coffee table in most of white America.
Yep.
Having a black photographer like Gordon Parks telling his story, what did that mean?
It was remarkable. There are things about Gordon Parks' life that are almost literally unbelievable. So you've already mentioned how in 1942 he went to work for the Farm Security Administration, which had a photographic unit which at that time was world famous. It had employed photographers who are historical figures like Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange, had produced this immense and immense and gorgeous body of work. Parks wanted to be there because he wanted to learn from those photographers, and he wanted to learn from the man who ran the organization, a guy called Roy Stryker.
Right.
Well, getting onto the staff at the Farm Security Administration was already a real coup for anybody, let alone for an African American. Now, the truth is, the Farm Security Administration hesitated to take him, and it took some pressure for them to accept him onto the staff as a professional. But
Do I understand the story that, in fact, he funded his employment there with the Rosenwald Fellowship?
That's right. Yeah, he had a fellowship from the Rosenwald Foundation, which funded African American artists and African American education. And, they were a very big organization at the time. They had the weight of the Ford Foundation does now, perhaps. Right. And it was pressure from the foundation that got him, that got the Farm Security Administration to accept him on the staff. He spends a few years there, then goes to New York City. The man who ran the Farm Security Administration photographic unit had moved to New York, and he was now running a similar operation at Standard Oil, Roy Stryker. Stryker brings Parks on board. Once again, it's a little bit of a struggle for Standard Oil to accept the idea that they have a black professional working for them. But he does it. He does it anyway. He also has time to freelance when he's working for Standard Oil. Gordon Parks was a fashion photographer, among other things. We've been talking about his documentary work. His documentary work is so important. But his fashion photography was very, very good. He loved it. It was one of the things that drew him into photography. He always wanted to do it. He had a talent for it. He went knocking on the door of the great fashion magazines in New York City. Now we're talking right after World War II. He goes knocking on the door of Harper's Bazaar. Harper's Bazaar says, "I'm sorry, we don't hire black people." Mm. But he also went knocking on the door of Vogue. And Vogue says, "Well, let's see your portfolio." They said, "That's pretty good. We'll give you some work." And he did a lot of work for Vogue, a lot. So imagine this, a black man photographing for Vogue, photographing these gorgeous white women in these beautiful gowns in the late 1940s. It doesn't make any sense at all. It shouldn't have happened.
Exactly. It's a fantasy.
It did happen for Gordon Parks. Well, then he goes to Life magazine, and by this time he's got this very impressive portfolio. He's got a portfolio that shows documentary work on the one side and shows fashion photography on the other side. The photo editor at Life magazine looks at it and says, "Yeah, we'll give you some work. We'll see how you do." And how did he do? He did spectacularly well. He knocked it out of the park. One of the first bylines he had in Life magazine was for fashion, the new fall furs in 1948. And the second big byline that he had was for a story on juvenile delinquents in Harlem. And that's the story that got people's attention. They'd never seen anything like it. He was inventing a new way to explore the African American community, that he had become friends and close to a 17-year-old neighborhood gang leader. Now, we're not talking about gangs like we think of them. They weren't waving submachine guns in the air. It was a neighborhood gang. They were stealing bicycles. Right. But he gets in with the gang. He becomes almost a member of the gang. He doesn't do any crimes. But, he hangs with them and does this really evocative exploration of their lives, showing, and what he wanted to do was to show that, yes, there is this element where they are juvenile delinquents and they are breaking the law. But they're also kids. And with the right kind of social services, with the right kind of help, we can turn their lives around. And so he's very clear to show both sides of their life. Hanging out with the gang, but hanging out with mom, hanging out with the girlfriend, hanging out with the little kids in the neighborhood. And this was new. He's inventing this. He has to invent this style of photography, this way of using the camera to tell these kinds of stories, because nobody else had done it ever before. He's inventing it.
Well, and that's, again, one of that initial story about the Harlem gangs. When you look at the photographs that he took of the family and being at home, it is what you might, it conveys to me the sense that this is an average American home.
Yeah.
These are people that appreciate their family. They have feelings like the rest of us, and that's so important to convey that, and he had this opportunity at Life magazine to do that. And I think we have to remember in the context, John, that this is a man who has achieved these levels of accomplishment starting with a camera he purchased in a pawn shop for
Sure.
$7.50.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Talent is real, and he certainly had it. So the first roll of film that he shot with that camera that he purchased in a pawn shop, when he went to develop it, you know this story, when he went to develop it, have it developed at a Kodak store, he goes back to pick up the film, pick up the prints. The guy behind the counter said, "Who made these pictures?" And he said, "I did." And the guy was surprised. The guy just couldn't believe that this young African-American man, but also this rank amateur, made the kind of pictures that were on that roll of film. And he said, "Well, you know, you keep this up, we'll give you a show." Parks kept it up, and he got his show in that little Kodak store.
You might say that.
So, you know, I've actually seen similar kinds of talent, though. I mean, among the things that I have done is do photography workshops for kids, you know, 7th, 8th, 9th grade. And, you know, you send a 7th, 8th, and 9th grader, send a bunch of them out with a little point-and-shoot digital camera. At the end of the day, at least one of them's going to come back with a really nice picture. You know, there is something innate about people who have an eye for what makes a good picture, even without knowing that they have it. Now, Parks was certainly that kind of guy. But as we both know, then he devotes himself to it body and soul. I mean, he puts an immense amount of work into developing this talent, into studying what does make a good picture. How can I make good pictures in a variety of circumstances? How do I take a picture in cloudy weather and sunny weather at night? How do I take a picture of a building, of a woman, of slums? I mean, you know, he becomes a real student of photography.
And I think you'll agree with me that, and to me, one of the other fascinating elements about Gordon Parks, and I had the opportunity, as you know, to spend time with him, and he was 87 years old here in Wichita. But still always creating, always trying to improve his craft. I mean, he started, as you know, working on color photography and more of a unique arty approach to his photographs rather than telling a story.
That's right.
He was trying to create beauty, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So he just continued to evolve as a photographer.
Yeah, he did. Even when he's doing what we think of as the gritty documentary work on social justice issues, he's continuing to photograph fashion. And he's continuing to be an experimental photographer, especially with color. And he was using a lot of techniques that at the time were new. You know, double exposures and painting backgrounds and photographing backgrounds and making collage and photographing sort of collages. I mean, it's work that I was a little slow to come around to. But now I do see it as very beautiful, for sure.
It is. And I think it's an important part of his whole career.
Yeah.
John, I would be remiss, since we are at Wichita State University, if I didn't ask you about your utilization of the papers that are in special collections at the Abloh Library.
Sure.
Tell our audience how you've utilized those resources.
Okay. So, I'm an historian. And if a historian wants to tell a story about somebody, you need sources, you need evidence. You can't make it up. I'm not a novelist, I'm an historian. And so what historians like are papers. Historians like letters. Historians like diary entries. Historians like memoranda within corporations. And what we have at Wichita State in the library are the Gordon Parks papers. And they are in an incredibly rich body of material that has everything from one of the typewriters that he used, to personal letters back and forth, to receipts from assignments at Life magazine, to notes from the field when he was working on stories for Life, to diary entries, to drafts, first draft, second draft, third, fourth, and fifth drafts of the various books and poetry that he wrote. And one of the things that's most interesting to me are letters to Gordon Parks and letters to the editors of Life magazine from readers who were moved by particular stories. So if he did a story on segregation in the South, if he did a story on the black Muslims, if he did a story on an impoverished family in Harlem, if he did a story on a poor boy in Rio, I can go to those files and I can look through the letters, and sometimes there are hundreds of letters. And you get a sense of how Parks is reaching people. Now, the letters are not all praise. Some of the letters are. Then they write in and say, "You're the most brilliant man who ever lived." And some of them write in and say, "You really touched my heart." Some of them are really hostile. Some of them are saying that, you're fanning the flames of racism, reverse racism, how can you treat, the black Muslims with respect or something like that. About poor people, well, why don't they stop having babies and get jobs? So but the point is that no matter what he did, he was touching people. He was evoking a response. Now, most of the responses were positive. And some of them are really emotional, that you can see that he really has reached deep inside some people, and they write back some extraordinary soul-searching and introspective letters. So here's a letter that I read the other day. As you know, I'm doing research while I'm here in Wichita. So I read a letter the other day, and it is about a story on segregation in the South. And a woman writes in. She identifies herself as a white Southerner, and she's the mother of 4 girls. And she's, I think, probably just has a high school education, judging from her grammar and a few spelling mistakes. It's a handwritten letter. It goes on for page after page, where she talks about growing up as a white girl in the segregated South and just sort of accepting segregation. Maybe knowing that something was a little wrong, but not having the words, the vocabulary, the ideas to challenge it in any way. And now being confronted by this story where Parks has taken her into the lives of this extended African American family and showed her that they are essentially people just like her, but look at all these constraints under which they work and the way that their lives are circumscribed by the rules of segregation in the South. She's really been touched. She pours out her heart. I have no idea where she takes it after that, but this has stimulated this poor woman into writing this 5 or 6 page handwritten letter to Gordon Parks. There are many letters where you can tell that people are really touched. And by the way, when I say many letters, I'm talking about hundreds in some cases. I'm not talking about 2 or 3.
Well, of course, it's very gratifying to me to know that those materials are of value to you and continue to promote the legacy of Gordon Parks and to tell his story. And again, we go back to the power of Life magazine in this period of time. And I think that there's a couple of stories there that we could talk about that not only shows the power of Gordon's photography and those stories, the essays that went along with his photographs, but his humanitarian efforts and impacting people, as I read, Flavio, the story of the young man in Brazil, and then the Fontanelles, his family. One of the photographs I really appreciate is at the Poverty Board, where it shows the mother with her children appealing to the administrative bureaucracy for support. But both of those stories led to influx of funds to provide medical care to Flavio and a new home for the Fontanelles. And that's, to me, powerful.
It is powerful. There's no question about it. So, as you say, in the story about the Brazilian boy and the story about the family in Harlem, they were separated by 7 or 8 years. But in both cases, Life magazine's readers not only sent letters, but they sent money. They said, we want to help this boy and we want to help this family. In both cases, Life contributed funds from the corporate account. In the case of the Brazilian boy, it moved his family out of the favela, out of their shanty, and into a nice built house. Flavio himself was very ill. He had severe asthma. He was brought to the United States and treated in Denver, Colorado, at an internationally respected children's hospital for respiratory diseases. In the case of the Harlem family, the Fontanelles, actually, you know, it's Fontanelli.
Really?
Yes. Gordon Parks
I did not
also
know that.
made a documentary film about the Fontanellis. It's based on his photography and his reporting from the story, but he made it as a film. It was shown on TV. It was shown on what was then called educational TV. But Parks introduces the film himself. And Norman, the father, is sitting right next to him, and he tells your viewer, this is Norman Fontanelli. And I think he probably knew how to pronounce the name. So I'd been pronouncing it Fontanelle all the time.
And I'm glad, you know, I've been educated. That's good
Yeah,
to know.
but you watch the film, it's the Fontanellis. But once again, Life's readers sent in money, donations. Life contributed to it. They moved them out of the slums of Harlem, moved them to Queens. But you know, in both of those cases, there's sort of a cautionary tale about what happens when you start interfering in people's lives. And in the case of the Brazilian family, they were moved out of their shanty, but the hopes and dreams of the father for setting up his own trucking business, I mean, they sort of came to naught. And in the case of the Fontanellis, it was actually quite tragic. They were moved to an apartment in Queens. Norman, the father, found a job, which he hadn't had, and so he found employment. But soon after they moved in, he fell asleep in the living room on the couch while smoking a cigarette. The cigarette fell onto the upholstery caught fire. The apartment catches fire. Norman, the father, dies, and one of the children dies in that fire. And the mother, Bessie, moves the family back to Harlem, where she has, you know, extended family and friends, and they go back. But to a large extent, the family is really damaged by that, and most of the children end up on the street and come to unhappy ends. Parks was troubled by this. And you know, he stayed in touch with both Flavio, the Brazilian boy, and with Richard Fontanelli, the youngest of the Fontanelli children. He stays in touch with them his entire life. You know, he flies back to Brazil and produces a book about Flavio. He's always trying to help Flavio. And you know, the Flavio story is not by no means tragic. I mean, Flavio's life was saved by his treatment in the Denver hospital. The boy would have died without that. And, you know, and he's lived, I mean, he's still alive. And so, you know, he's lived a good life, and the family was helped. Did they achieve the Brazilian dream? Probably not, but, you know, it was good. Parks also stayed in touch with the Fontanelli family. And the youngest child, Richard, did manage to build a good life for himself.
Good.
He became a member of the maintenance staff at Columbia University. He was a part-time musician, had a part-time recording studio, and Parks helped him set up the recording studio. Married, you know, had 2 beautiful children. The tragedy there is he died so young. You know, he had not yet reached his 50th birthday when he died, very suddenly. I mean, it's really, it's a heartbreaking story.
It is. It is in so many ways.
Yeah.
And as we close out our interview, John, there's so much more we could talk about, but a couple of items I think I need to get to. And what do you want to tell? What is the focus of your book? What story do you want to tell?
Okay. The focus of my book is to argue for the historical importance of Gordon Parks. He is now, in the history of photography, but generally in the art world, he's thought of somebody who has produced some powerful, iconic photographs, and some photographs of great beauty. But he's not seen as somebody who used words and images in the pages of Life magazine to address these issues of race and poverty in the United States and around the world, and bring them to this vast audience of Life's readers, affecting them and moving them, and thereby becoming one of the foremost interpreters of African American life and culture of his era. And do I mean to say one of the foremost interpreters? Am I comparing him with the likes of Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin? I certainly am. Now, I'm not going to argue that the text that he wrote for Life magazine or his A Choice of Weapons, I'm not going to argue that these books have the literary stature of the writings of Baldwin and Ellison. But I will tell you that they are very good. He has a very blunt and direct style of writing that also manages to reach the reader emotionally and intellectually. But you combine his writing with his photographs. Now, he was a great photographer, one of the greatest photographers to ever live. We can compare his photography as an artistic achievement to anything that Ralph Ellison or James Baldwin ever wrote.
I agree.
So you compare if you do what he wanted you to do, which is to understand his work as a totality, that is words and photography together, then we see that he reaches this, very, very, very high pinnacle of somebody who spoke directly, extensively to white Americans about the African American experience.
I know you're continuing to do research, and I think you're going down to Fort Scott to
That's
continue. Any idea when we can expect the book?
I think it'll be finished in 2017.
Good.
And publications have long tails, but the book will be arriving soon enough, and I'm really excited to work on it. I'd have to say this will not be my last trip to Wichita, God willing. This is a place you have to come if you want to study Gordon Parks seriously. The archival collection of his papers that is here is the best in the country, by far, the richest, the most extensive. So I'll have to come back and do more reading in it. And as you know, the Ulrich Museum, Wichita State University's Ulrich Museum of Art, now owns something on the order of 170 Gordon Parks photographs, which is the second largest collection in any museum anywhere in the world. And so that's also a place where people are going to come if they want to know about Gordon Parks. The great thing about the Ulrich collection is that it has so many of the Life magazine photographs. But when I say Life magazine photographs, I mean not only the ones that showed up in the pages of Life magazine, but the unpublished photographs. So you can get a sense of what else he was shooting on these assignments, which often lasted for months. He was with the black Muslims for months. He made hundreds of photographs. Well, here you can get a sense of what those other photographs were all about, what didn't make it into the pages of Life.
And that certainly means a lot to me, and I think Wichita State can be very proud of its resources and its efforts to honor Gordon Parks and the Parks family, and working with the Gordon Parks Foundation back in New York, we really have achieved a lot, in my opinion. In closing out, John, we've talked about my impression of Gordon Parks, not only from everything that I've read and his work that I've viewed and music I've listened to and movies I've watched, but having that personal interaction. My sense of it was, as an 87-year-old man, he was dignified, he was caring, he was appreciative of the attention that he was receiving here in Wichita, and he was very comfortable with what he'd achieved, and I think in some sense at rest regarding his life, his struggles, and he had learned from that. What are your impressions of Gordon Parks?
No, I agree entirely with you. That I've never met the man. I'm sorry I did not, even though our lives overlapped. I never met him. So I know him through his photographs and through his writing and through hearing people talk about him. But I've read the poetry that he wrote towards the end of his life. And as we both know, this man never stopped creating. He was photographing in his apartment even when he couldn't get out of his apartment, and creating these beautiful color abstracts, which are really quite something.
Fabulous, fabulous.
The poetry that he wrote, I think it's telling. It is written by a man who's at peace. It's written by a man who senses that his time on earth is short, but who recognizes that it's inevitable, might even be good that his time is coming. He's lived this extraordinary life. He's at peace with it. He is. he might even be looking forward to the next act, right? What happens now?
I would not be surprised.
Yeah.
John, thank you so much for spending time with us, for coming to Wichita, and of course, for writing and studying about Gordon Parks. A scholar of your renown, it means a lot for you, and it means to me a lot for you to take the time to do this research. It's been an enjoyable interview. I know our audience is going to love your insights. Look forward to your lecture at the Ulrich, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Ted. It's my honor and privilege to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.